I'm Jackson Bird, and it is October, spooky month. It is the month of Halloween, and that means I would like to share with you some of my favorite Hallow reads. Yeah, that's what I'm calling it. Hallow reads. It's sounds like something that like a 4th grade teacher would put up in their classroom to try to get the kids amped about reading for October. That might be my brand. 4th grade teacher trying to encourage their kids through not so clever classroom decoration. Well, in any case, I love this season. I love Halloween, and so I always like to try to read lots of seasonal books around that time. I guess I like reading seasonally in general. I like summer reads. I like trying to read wintry books. But this is like my favorite season, and there's so much good literature, whether it's explicitly based around Halloween or just kind of spooky. This is not a comprehensive list, but it is quite a bit bigger than just the, hey, here's what I've been reading this year, or here are some of my favorites. So buckle in, because I've got a lot to recommend. Why don't we start with some classics? You cannot go wrong with Ray Bradbury during this season, and so I, this year, picked up The Halloween Tree, which is a little bit more, I wouldn't go quite as low as middle grade, maybe, but I like all of these books from, like, before my time when kids could just, like, go out and have fun as kids and get up to mischief. We don't have that in quite the same way these days. So if you want that, but with some added scary mystery, Ray Bradbury's The Halloween Tree. Murder mysteries are also great for this time, so of course you gotta read some Agatha Christie, and again, I went for the most explicitly Halloween-themed Agatha Christie, Halloween Party. It's one of the Hercule Poirot mysteries, but it also includes, what is her name again? Ariadne Oliver, which is basically Agatha Christie's, like, alter ego in her books. Also includes a character named Judith Butler, which I had fun with. Basically, it starts with a Halloween party where a child is murdered! And then they have to solve the mystery from there. And, they eat a lot of apples. Actually, they stop eating apples. Agatha Christie is apparently the most widely published author of all time. She's published like 1 billion books. I'm not exaggerating. Actually, 1 billion books in English and then like another billion in other languages. So, you know, this is the 39th Hercule Poirot book. Don't feel like you need to read all of them to get up to this one. You can read them out of order. She does a lot of exposition every time, so you won't be missing out. Going even darker still, if you are a fan of horror films, maybe like The Haunting, you might like The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson was a master of the horror genre. You probably had to read her short story, The Lottery, when you were in high school. Basically, like, the original Hunger Games-ish. That's how I've always thought of it in my head. I, of course, always like to do a reread of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, especially because I'm going to Sleepy Hollow this weekend, so I always like to read it right before I go. It's good to actually read it if you haven't, because there's a lot of things that we have said are part of the lore of Legend of Sleepy Hollow that actually were not in the text at all. Like, the Headless Horseman does not have a pumpkin for a head, as is depicted in a lot of the cartoons and stuff. There was just a pumpkin, like, thrown at Ichabod Crane at some point. Alright, so going a little bit more contemporary, although not current. I have not finished it yet, but I am loving Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Practical Magic movie. I have more newly come to it, but it is amazing, and so it's fun kind of reading the original book. The movie, if you've not seen it, stars Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman as sisters who are kind of witches. They live with their witch-like aunts, and lots of mysterious stuff kind of happens as they're growing up, and the book is pretty similar. I don't know, but just something about the, like, 90s New England witchy vibes I'm super into, and I can't find often enough, so I'm digging it for that reason. Fun thing I discovered this year, my library has an entire, like, metadata tag just for lesbian vampires. So if that's your thing, well, you've got to read The Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez. However, I also recommend Fledgling by Octavia Butler, both of whom are actually black lesbian vampires, although in Fledgling the sexuality is a little bit more fluid and amorphous there. Fledgling picks up after the main character, like, suffers from amnesia and wakes up in the body of a young girl, so you're kind of working with that framework of sort of rediscovery and self-discovery, and then some vampire politics that you get into later. The Gilda Stories takes place across a couple of centuries, so you get sort of a broader view and a lot of fun little historical fiction stuff. Fun little is maybe not the correct words for this. Also, as you might expect from being lesbian vampire stories, they're both a little steamy. Just a caution on that. Alright, let's talk graphic novels. I got a bunch of them here. I've recommended this before. I still love it. It's one of my favorite ongoing series by Molly Ostertag. called The Witch Boy, the sequel, The Hidden Witch, and then I think there's a third one coming out, I'm not sure. Well, it follows like a boy and his family who live in a big house in the woods, and in their world, boys become shapeshifters and girls become witches, but he's a boy who's a witch. So clearly I'm gonna love something that is breaking gender roles and playing with gender nonconformity in a magical world. It's actually an urban fantasy though. There's like the real world as it exists, and then there's the sort of magical people that live in tandem, and most of the muggles don't know about the magical world, but they do start blending together a little bit more as the series goes on. This one just came out this year. I'm so stoked about it. Pumpkinheads by Rainbow Rowell, illustrated by Faith Erin Hicks. This is super fun. It's two best friends who work annually at a pumpkin patch, the best pumpkin patch in the world. There's even a map of the pumpkin patch. Love a good map in a book, but especially when it's just of a pumpkin patch, not like some fantasy worlds or something. It's pretty queer. It's gonna make you want to eat all of the seasonal foods. And I don't know, it was just wonderful. I really, really liked it. There's also someone who like kind of looks like David S. Pumpkins in it. Actually, no, it's like more like the newscaster. You know, the dancing gif of the pumpkin head in the all black. That's what this character looks like. So the Witch Boy and Pumpkinheads are both like middle grade to YA-ish. We got another one in that category, which is the Oz books. Did you know that the first 6 Wizard of Oz books were illustrated by Marvel into graphic novels a couple years ago? They're amazing. I love the illustrations. Who are they done by? Illustrator is Scotty Young. I personally think The Marvelous Land of Oz, which is the second book, is the most fall-ish, mostly because Jack Pumpkinhead is in it. One of my favorite characters from all the books I read growing up. Also, it features Pip. I don't know how to say this without being a spoiler, but basically, did you know that this book written in 1903 has some trans themes? So check out The Marvelous Land of Oz, and if you can, get the graphic novel version from Marvel. So this one I have not finished yet, because look how big it is. But it is called My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. It is so cool. It takes place in 1960s Chicago, and the whole thing is as if it's a notebook. So it's like the main character's notebook of like drawings and stuff. Okay, it's kind of hard to see on screen, but these are all like notebook pages and sketches. It's a murder mystery, kind of historical fiction, got a lot of like monster movie, pulp fiction elements to it. Oh yeah, and the whole like notebook thing, the main character is a 10-year-old girl investigating the mystery of her murdered neighbor. This book is going all over the place so far, and it's just so like vibrant and engrossing, and I just really want more people to know about it because I'm really, really liking it so far. Also, you get a workout when you hold it all day. It's a monster. So going back to straight up fiction novel recommendations. Earlier this year, I read The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kirsten White, and I loved it, like more than I thought I would. I will preface this by saying I am a huge Frankenstein fan, like of the actual book. I've read it many, many times. I just love Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley and the whole history of her and how weird and goth she was. But the text of Frankenstein itself is very rich, and The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein plays with that a lot. So I might recommend rereading Frankenstein before you read it, although it's definitely not necessary, but I think it does enrich your experience. Basically, the book is written from the perspective of a minor side character in Frankenstein. I mean, it's kind of like Frankenstein fanfiction. Seeing that other side of Victor, you know, the actual Frankenstein, is really fascinating, and yeah, I highly recommend it. Another book I read earlier this year is Out of Salem by Hal Shreve. It is so good. It is a YA novel, and the main character is a non-binary witch zombie who befriends a lesbian Muslim vampire. And it's just as great as that sounds. What I loved about it was, I mean, you've got all this like adventure and like self-discovery and identity like exploration that's happening, but it's in a world, it's an urban fantasy, and it's in a world where all of that magic and monsters exists, but the government really regulates it, and there's a lot of discrimination against certain types of monsters. But none of that is a metaphor for the types of discrimination and challenges that marginalized identities in our real world face. All of that is there too. So there's like some trans werewolves who are discriminated against for being trans. There's a lot of talk about police brutality. The werewolf friend faces Islamophobia. And so Hal Shreve did a really fantastic job of weaving those together and not making like one being a stand-in for the other. But mostly like we don't have enough books with non-binary characters, and so to get like non-binary and all kinds of other representation plus spooky monsters, was really cool. Now here's one that I read many years ago, and I actually am kind of excited to reread it again because I've forgotten a lot of it, but it's called The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane by Catherine Howe. So in this book, it is a grad student who, like, I think her grandma dies or something, and she has to go clean out the house, and she discovers this, like, basically treasure map-ish of a family secret that's maybe they're kind of like witches. Oh yeah, by the way, the house she's cleaning out is in Salem. And I think I read this when I still lived in the South, so I'm really curious to like reread it now that I've lived up north for a while. I've visited Massachusetts a lot. I just went to Salem last weekend for the first time, so I think I might get a little bit more out of it now. But I remember when I read it a decade ago, it was really, really fascinating. I think it kind of cuts back and forth between present day and then the time period of the main character's family that she's investigating. The main character is basically an archivist, which I think is exciting, but that might not be the best way to sell it to people. Speaking of my trip to Salem, ahead of that, I was reading A Season with the Witch by J.W. Acker. So basically, he is what does he do? He goes to lots of weird places and writes about lots of spooky things, but in 2015, he moved his family to Salem, Massachusetts for a month to sort of see what's up with Witch City. You know, let's investigate some of the history of Salem and of the witch trials, but also of how this town has sort of become a tourist trap. And how do people who live there feel about that? How did that happen when actually, if you look at it, the Salem witch trials are not the most remarkable witch trials that ever happened? And interestingly, for a book that I feel is so comprehensive about Salem, Massachusetts in both its past and present, I did not see it in any stores that were selling books when I was in Salem. I went to basically everywhere that sells books, as I do when I visit a new town, and I didn't see it anywhere. So Salem, sell his book, it's good. I do really like learning about the history of Halloween and all of its different incarnations across space and time, so I do have a couple of non-fiction recommendations in addition to that last one for you. My favorite history of Halloween book is called Halloween, The History of America's Darkest Holiday by David J. Schall. It didn't used to be called this. This is like the second or third edition. It used to be called Death Makes a Holiday, A Cultural History of Halloween, and it did not have a cover that was this cheesy? I don't love the new cover, but the text itself is still just as good. I learned so much from this book. It talks about, you know, Samhain and all the original, like, Gaelic things, and then how it came to America and how it's evolved over the years. It even gets into, like, Castro Street and some of the LGBT culture in the 20th century. It talks about all of the myths of razor blades and candy and stuff like that. And also has my favorite description of Halloween of all time. He calls it a cultural collision of glitter and grave dust, which is just like the best description ever of so many things, even beyond Halloween. Ugh, I just love it. Glitter and grave dust. There's a number of other, like, vaguely comprehensive history of Halloween books out there, and I haven't read them all. I have been reading through Trick or Treat, A History of Halloween by Lisa Morton, which is a little bit newer than David J. Schall's book. I haven't found it overly different yet, but, you know, your mileage may vary. Maybe you like this one better. If you want to get a little tangential to Halloween, however, I do recommend Pumpkin, The Curious History of an American Icon by Cindy Ott. I love history books that are on one specific thing. Like, you ever read the book Salt? Great. Paper? Also good. Pumpkin. It's great. It does a lot of, you know, myth busting of our Thanksgiving traditions here in America, and talks about, yeah, what it is kind of weird. Americans eat so much pumpkin, but really just at one time of the year. So if you want to learn a lot about history through the lens of one very specific thing, read Pumpkin. Okay, that was a lot, and there's so many more I could say. I mean, this is a great time to, like, reread Harry Potter. It's a great season for the Raven Boys. I didn't even mention The Witches of Eastwick. Picture of Dorian Gray kind of fits right now. Like I said, any murder mystery stuff, way more stuff from Ray Bradbury, H.P. Lovecraft. I also, around this time, sometimes like to flip through the Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of the Witches, which was like the, I don't know, guidebook for finding and killing witches back in the 1400s. It's ridiculous. Oh, which reminds me of Good Omens. Good Omens, lots of other Neil Gaiman stuff, really great to read, and in fact, Agnes Nutter from Good Omens, I always think of Deliverance Dane when I think of Agnes Nutter. I don't know, they're one and the same in my head, even though they're totally not. The one last book I will leave you with, I have barely started it now, but it's a brand new book just released. You might have heard of it, Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. It's his first new novel since The Perks of Being a Wallflower. It's a big one, which is why I've not quite read it yet, but it's about a 7-year-old boy and his single mother, and he disappears, and then he comes back, and now he hears voices, and there's a lot going on with it. That all sounds like a good scary read for this time of the year. Oh, also Stephen King's The Institute sounds really good. It sounds kind of X-Men-y, but I'm like number 70 on the waitlist at the library, so I probably won't be reading that as a Hallow read. And while we're talking about heavy hitters who have put out new books, Margaret Atwood's The Testaments was so good. It is a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. I think was kind of written to maybe give us some hope in our time right now, because it is about the fall of the regime in The Handmaid's Tale, and I sped through that. It was also a very big book, which usually takes me a long time, but I read in a couple of days. Okay, I better stop now. I'm gonna keep recommending books this whole time, but if any of those books sounded interesting to you, I have put them all down in the description box below. I'll also share my Goodreads, where I am always curating different lists of things, especially lists of like trans authors or books with trans characters. So if you want to see any of that, you can follow me on Goodreads, and you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram at JACKISNOTABIRD. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a Hallow read at all, but you could get my book by clicking a link down below. It is called Sorted: Growing Up, Coming Out, and Finding My Place. It is a memoir and educational guide, and there is quite a bit of Halloween stuff at the beginning. Kind of do an overview of my personal history with Halloween, because I love Halloween, so I could not write about it in the book. Also, like Halloween, trans people, exploring your identity, dressing up. There's a lot of stuff that goes in there. Maybe that's a little bit why I like Halloween so much. I don't know. But in any case, I have given you so much to read for Halloween in November and this wonderful fall season, or whenever, really. Sorry for making your TBR too long. Sorry, not sorry. Please leave me some of your Hallow read recommendations down in the comments, and let me know if you pick up any of these books and what you think of them. With all of that, happy Halloween. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.